And we're also really fortunate this morning to hear from Sally Kornbluth. As you know, Sally was appointed provost in 2014 and reappointed for a second term in 2019, and her full bio is in your program. Sally is a terrific Duke leader and, of course, is the chief academic officer of the university. And in addition to the tremendous responsibility of overseeing the schools, programs, and units, she and her team are incredibly supportive of engaging alumni in the lives of our students and in the university, and in thinking about ways that lifelong learning and programs like this weekend can be a reality for our alumni. So, Sally, good morning. Thank you.
So I've been, thank you, Sterling, I've been charged with the task of doing an overview of academics in under 10 minutes. So rather than speaking incredibly quickly, I think I'll just pick a couple of items here. So, I've spoken at this with this group before about the strategic plan of Duke, which we completed a couple of years ago now. And there were four sort of goals, and I'm maybe going to tell you about just one or two highlights from some of these goals. So the first goal was to invest in Duke faculty as scholars and leaders of the university's intellectual communities. And so one of the things I wanted to tell you about from that first sort of pillar of the academic strategic plan had to do with building science and technology at Duke. So when I came over, I was a vice dean in the medical school before becoming provost. And when I came over, I sort of was looking at the landscape, and I saw that what we call the campus side really needed to have an investment in the sciences. And at the same time, the medical school leadership was coming to the conclusion that they needed to up their game in fundamental basic discovery science. And I should say that the leadership of the health system and the School of Medicine and the leadership on the campus side, the deans, myself, President Price, are all extremely aligned in what we want to do. And so we actually started to think about searching for top scientists across the country, actually across the world, in different ways than we had done before. And we have comprised search committees rather than in departments or in particular units, but search committees across the university of our top scientists, and let our top scientists try to find top people. And we've also thought about how we build on strength that we already have. So we picked just a few, not that we're not going to hire across the sciences, but we picked a few areas where we thought we were already on our way in an upward trajectory. One of them is material science. One of them is what the medical school is calling biological resilience. And what that actually means is if you have a stroke or a heart attack, how do you recover? How do we make biological systems more resilient? And then the third pillar is artificial intelligence for health. So everybody in the world is working on AI now. We have the option and the opportunity of working closely with our math and stats departments, et cetera, our engineering school and our medical school to think about how we can improve the medical experience. And what's really interesting is Larry Karen, our vice president for research, has already piloted some of these experiments. And it turns out that artificial intelligence can do better than a pathologist now in diagnosing thyroid cancer. It can do better than a pathologist with some other imaging modalities. So if you look at radiology, you look at pathology, anything that relies on imaging, I think you're going to see a change in the paradigm there in terms of how things are interpreted. The other thing that they're working on is, when you go to the doctor now, you sit and the doctor's filling out the electronic health record and asking you these questions over and over again, and it's actually a major cause of burnout for physicians as well as stress in the patient relationship. And so folks on the campus side, led by Larry Karen and others in the School of Engineering, are trying to figure out how you could get the equivalent of Alexa or Hey Google or whatever to listen to the conversation and populate the electronic health record so that the physician wouldn't have to do it. So those are the kind of things we're thinking about there. And I'm happy to say that in the sort of material science, another arm of that is also something we're interested in is quantum computing and computational thinking. And we just scored a really fabulous, huge hire. His name is Chris Monroe. He's a world-renowned National Academy member, quantum computing fellow. So I think we're really off and running. So another goal was to provide a transformative educational experience for all of our students. So I think many of you are aware of, from having been undergraduates here, potentially, or thinking about how we educate students. And I think there's now become a sort of unique, what I would call almost cool buzz on something that makes Duke a little bit different. And this is an emphasis on uh, being able to work as a member of a team, being able to work across disciplines, and being able to think about complicated problems and break them down into pieces that can be solvable. So maybe some of you are aware of things like Bass Connections, which are team-based endeavors, usually a graduate student, a faculty member, some undergraduates who work on real-world problems. So that's gotten extremely popular. I think there's 60 some odd teams this year. Probably many of you are familiar with Duke Engage. We're expanding Duke Engage in ways that are interesting. I think we want to be getting more into sort of rural areas in North Carolina and South Carolina, as well as trying to make an impact globally. And then we have an interesting piece for those of you who are part of professional schools. We have something we're developing called Reimagining the Professions. And a lot of it is catching students who are pre-med, pre-law, et cetera, to think about their future careers holistically. So for instance, we ran 2 years of something we called Reimagining Medicine, where students were trained more in sort of humanistic pursuits. How do you think about medicine in a humanistic way? And we're starting to think about, how we'll do reimagining law, reimagining business, et cetera. So I think you're going to see more of that in the coming year. Another thing, our third goal was to strengthen Duke's capacity to address global challenges for communities across the world. I have to say, we have a lot of global activities. Our concentration has shifted in the last few months in ways we had not anticipated because of the coronavirus. But because many of you know, we have a campus, a joint venture university, Duke Kunshan University, in China. For any of you who are curious, almost all the students are home now, but we are mounting a full online semester within a matter of 3 weeks. So this is sort of short-term utility for us in continuing the student enterprise at DKU, but it's going to have utility after that as well across the board. And I think we want to use this for a model of how we can combine sort of distance learning with the real highlights of a Duke education. And then finally, I'll say that we want to create a supportive environment for research, learning, and academic communities. And this is, there are a whole lot of things going on in this goal across the board, but a couple things I'll mention. If you look at the previous strategic plans at Duke, graduate students are barely mentioned. And it turns out we really have as many or more graduate students as undergraduates on campus now. And so there has been a really strong push called Reimagining Doctoral Education, or RIDE, led by Vice Provost Ed Ballison, to think about how we prepare our graduate students, again, for life beyond Duke. Not all, in fact, many of our graduate students do not go into the academy now. They're doing PhDs or master's degrees for other pursuits. So, for instance, we've started something called a Summer Doctoral Academy, where we'll work with doctoral students on public speaking, on negotiation, on basic coding and using apps, things they might use in their career beyond Duke if they don't go into the academy, or even if they do go into the academy, that will be useful. We are working hard on trying to think about how we prepare students for careers outside the academy, and also just to get them to think critically about really what they want to do and why they want to do it. And so this is, like, as I said, a whirlwind tour. There are many elements of all of this. I am always happy to, hear people's input, take questions over time, but I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot. And so with that, I will change gears. So to think about our next panel. I have the pleasure of introducing, I guess, the moderator of the panel, Kerry Abrams, who is the James B. Duke and Benjamin N. Duke Dean of the School of Law. I always like to say this, but Kerry is one of our 7 women deans now at Duke. So, and we just have and she's among the newest of the cohort, and it's just been fantastic to see this sort of esprit de corps and the interactions. This is not to denigrate our fantastic male deans as well, but it really has been great. So Kerry became the law school dean on July 1st, 2018. She's well known for writing on family-based migration and the history of immigration law. And indeed, Kerry helped us out in our most recent Provost Forum on immigration. Prior to her appointment at Duke, Dean Abrams served on the faculty of the University of Virginia for 13 years, and most recently as Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs. And I will say as an aside, her experience as Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs is incredibly evident in her leadership of the law school, because a lot of a dean's job is to navigate complex interpersonal relationships between faculty and students, et cetera. It's not simple. You have to be sort of not only an academic leader, but a master of HR and sometimes a master of complex psychology. And she has all of those traits. Because as vice provost, she was responsible university-wide for faculty recruitment and retention, faculty policies, promotion and tenure, professional and leadership development programs for faculty. So she has actually got a lot of qualifications and experience that make her a great dean. She also has all of the credentials to be leader of our law schools. She was a graduate of Swarthmore and then of Stanford Law School. She clerked for Judge Stanwood R. Duval Jr. of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana. And she also practiced as a commercial litigator in New York City. So she's really had all kinds of aspects of both in the law profession and in sort of faculty and student interactions, which make her a terrific dean. So, Kerry.
I just want to take a couple of minutes to welcome all of you to our first panel of the morning. It's a real honor for me to get to be a part of Women's Weekend and a part of Duke University. Our panel is entitled 100 Years After the 19th Amendment, Women's Voice and the Vote. So as you probably are aware, this year is the centennial of the 19th Amendment. We have now had the right to vote as women in this country for 100 years. And on this panel, we want to take a few moments to think about what that means for us today. For those of you who have not read the 19th Amendment recently, I thought I would read it to you. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So if you think about that for a moment, prior to the 19th Amendment, women could be denied the right to vote, and indeed were in many states and had no federal right to vote. Today, we're going to consider the history of the amendment, situating it in its context. We'll discuss what the amendment did and didn't do for women. And then finally, we're going to consider what still holds women back and whether we need additional law or social change to move forward even further. So before we get started, I'd like to invite our panelists up, and I'll introduce them one by one. Our first panelist is Professor Sarah Deutsch. She is Professor of History and Gender and Feminist Studies at Duke. And some interesting facts about Professor Deutsch include that she was in the very first class of Women Rhodes Scholars. Wow. And has degrees from both Oxford and Yale. She's the author of 3 books, most recently Women and the City, Gender, Space, and Power in Boston, 1870 to 1940. She served as the second woman chair of the history department at Duke, 25 years after Anne Ferror Scott served as the department's first chair. She served as program co-chair for annual conferences for the American Studies Association and the Organization of American Historians, as dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at Duke, and as chair of the executive committee of delegates of the American Council of Learned Societies and on the executive committee of the OAH. Her current book project is Making a Modern West, 1898 to 1942. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Patricia Timmons-Goodson, who is currently the vice chair of the United States Commission of Civil Rights.
I think I can get up here.
Justice Timmons-Goodson received her BA and JD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an LLM from Duke University Law School in our Judicial Master's program. She told me before she came up here today that she is a triple Tar Heel, and then her friends tell her that she got to Duke as soon as she could. Justice Timmons-Goodson began her career as a district manager of the United States Census Bureau in the Department of Commerce from 1979 to 1980. And then her justice career began as an assistant prosecutor and continued as a legal services lawyer in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Most recently, she was an associate justice on the Supreme Court of North Carolina from 2006 to 2012, and an associate judge on the North Carolina Court of Appeals from 1997 to 2005, and a district court judge of the 12th Judicial District of North Carolina from 1984 to 1997. The judicial selection system employed by North Carolina required her to stand before the voters in 2 statewide elections and 3 district elections during her judicial career. The 28-year tenure on the bench was marked by distinguished work on each of these 3 courts. And then finally, our third panelist is Kathy Tran. She is currently a delegate to the Virginia House of Delegates for the 42nd District representing Fairfax County in Virginia. But before that, she's had a long and storied life and career. Delegate Tran and her parents fled Vietnam as boat refugees when she was 7 months old. On the voyage, she grew so sick that she almost died at sea. Although many other countries offered them asylum, they waited 13 months for the United States to accept their application. She graduated from Duke University and earned her Master of Social Work from the University of Michigan. During her 12 years of service at the U.S. Department of Labor, Ms. Tran served in numerous leadership positions, including as the acting administrator for the Office of Workforce Investment and the director of the Division of Policy, Legislation, and Regulation. Kathy went on to work at the National Immigration Forum, one of the nation's leading immigration advocacy organizations. And since 2018, she has served in the Virginia House of Delegates. Welcome. So I'd like to start out by situating the 19th Amendment in historical context. So it gave women the right to vote nationwide. That was a very, very significant moment. If you think about the Constitution, it's really the document that enshrines our country's collective civic values. And women were finally included in that document for the first time. But the amendment didn't spring up overnight. Women and men had fought for years for this right for women and had actually already achieved it in some states and territories prior to the ratification of the federal amendment. So I'd like to take some time to think about what women's citizenship was like in the 19th century. Why was there so much resistance to women's voting? And why was the amendment ratified when it was? Sarah, do you want to start us out on that as the historian on the panel?
Yes, I can take a stab at that. So one of the things you have to remember is when women first began to meet in conventions and organize about their rights in the mid-19th century, there were a lot of things they were organizing for. One of the things they wanted was control over their own bodies. They wanted to control their own wages. They wanted to control their own property. The vote was only one of the things that they asked for, but it was by far the most controversial thing they asked for. And it was controversial because until the Jacksonian era, there were a lot of men who couldn't vote, as well as a lot of women. But once Jackson and that regime expanded dramatically the right of white men in particular, some black men lost the right when white men got it, but expanded the right of white men to vote almost universally. It created this big distinction between men and women, and the vote became identified with manhood. And elections were these messy things where people brawled and fought and drank and sold votes and did everything that women were not supposed to do. So it was shocking to think that women would want to be embroiled in that kind of arena. So one of the things that women had to do was to come up with all these logics for why it made sense to give women the vote. And some women argued that it made sense because women were people and they had human rights like other people. That was not the most popular way to frame it, oddly enough. So then women began to say, well, we stand above all that messiness and we'll elevate politics and we'll work for things that matter to society at large. And they were able to do a lot. Organized women can get a lot accomplished, even without the vote, even outside the electoral process. And they were able to get many things done. They were able to get mothers' pensions in some states. They were able to get various welfare enterprises going at the state level, things like school lunch. But the vote was still a stumbling block, and so they organized a number of different ways. They started state by state organizing. When there were leftist regimes that came in, and like the populists, women would get the vote with the populists. But aside from that, it was very hard for women to get the vote. And then they finally began to organize precinct by precinct. They had a great grassroots ground game. We all know how important those things are in electoral politics. And they made alliances. And women may be able to get a lot done when they organize, but they can't do any of it without alliances. And some of these alliances were less than savory. So when women who were running the national organizations decided they wanted to get the South, they meant the white South, and they were willing to accept white women's organizations that excluded black women in doing this. And when they decided they wanted to get the Southwest, they were willing to not look after the interests of people we would now call sort of Latinx voters. And so there were divisions even before they actually got to the vote that then carried over after they got the vote. So when we get the vote in 1920, it's white women who get enfranchised everywhere. It's black women in the North who get enfranchised. Black women in the South don't get enfranchised until the Voting Rights Act in the 60s. Puerto Rican women don't get the vote until 1929. Women on reservations don't get the vote until the men also do in 1924. So there's this complexity that comes with it. And the alliances are central, and often elite women didn't even want the vote because they had other ways to be influential, and they didn't want to vote with their maids. So you have to, there's all these conflicts coming to the fore, and then women have to learn all over again how to do politics. And when they first get the vote, the men are like, oh my God, we have a voting bloc of women. We're going to pass, and they did, the first maternal and infant welfare that the federal government had ever provided. We're going to do a disarmament conference. We're going to let women have citizenship, even if they marry people who aren't citizens. And then by the late 20s, it was apparent that women didn't vote as a bloc. And that women, like men, voted their economic interests and their other things, and so the guys stopped listening. And Eleanor Roosevelt talks about going to the Democratic Convention in the 20s and being excluded from all the important committee meetings. Mm-hmm. So now I'll let you guys pick.
Would you like to add that?
Yes, I was only going to add that I'm so glad that Sarah mentioned African American women in that while the work and the effort was being made to get suffrage for women, it was not assured that African American women would be included. As a matter of fact, there was strong resistance by the Southern legislators who vehemently did not want black folks included. So we take, it appears, a lot for granted now, but it certainly was not easy.
Kathy, did you want to add anything?
Probably. So just a little bit of that history is tied to the area of Virginia that I represent, Southern Fairfax County, if you know Northern Virginia geography. And Alice Paul and other suffragists were demonstrating in front of the White House at the turn of, the turn of World War I, when we were just starting that war. And I think the president found it really unseemly that women would be demonstrating for the right to vote while, men were going off to war, and he felt that was really unpatriotic. And so this is somewhat from, I'm sitting next to a historian, somewhat of history from a movie with Alyssa Milano, but I will confess she did come and talk about it. But and so he imprisoned Alice Paul, who went on to write the Equal Rights Amendment, and other suffragists in the Lorton Workhouse, which is located in my district. Mm-hmm. And there was an evening in 1917 where these women, they were on a hunger strike, and the guards were really upset, and they were clubbed. They had been force-fed. They were shackled. And so that their treatment became known as the Night of Terror. And it somehow came out to the public and to the press that this was how these women were being treated. And I think we like to say in the 42nd District that really became the turning point and the groundswell of then support to ratify the 19th Amendment. So this year, if you come in August to celebrate the 100th anniversary, as immense as that expansion of democracy was, and as flawed as it was, you can come, and they will be unveiling the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial to celebrate the expansion of democracy to women, and also to start a leadership program for young girls around, growing up as strong and fierce leaders themselves.
So it's 1920. We have the 19th Amendment now. We've started to talk a little bit about what that didn't do, but I'd like to flesh that out a little bit more. So what differences did a national right to vote immediately start to make for women? And then in what spaces was there a lot of work still to be done? And can we start to think about the story of additional movements around women's rights that continued throughout the 20th century?
So, I mean, there continued to be massive sort of labor movements. There was some conflict among women about whether you wanted a minimum wage for women or not. The minimum wage for women gets thrown out, and that becomes a whole, like, what do you do with that? And the Equal Rights Amendment is blamed. The idea of the Equal Rights Amendment and equal rights for women is blamed for throwing out the minimum wage for women. So there's a lot of framing that goes on that isn't necessarily in the control of the people who need to do the work. And so that has to be reframed. Alice Paul starts the National Women's Party to back the ERA. African-American women come to her and say, well, we still have this problem in the South where we don't even have the vote. And she says, that's not, that's a different problem. We're focusing on this problem of the Equal Rights Amendment. So one of the major things that had to be done was the recreation of alliances that would be effective going forward. And it's not. And the other problem women had, the machine politicians and the men in party politics didn't want women to run because it wasn't clear what they brought to the table, because women didn't vote as a bloc, and women had positioned themselves as above politics. So they weren't even loyal party members. So why would you invite those people into your tent? And so there had to be a lot of work done by women to get that kind of right, and a lot of that happened with Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary Dewson in the Democratic Party. They were sort of partners off to the side of Roosevelt. And so that work had to be done to rebuild. But I really think the major thing that has made the most difference is Emily's List. Because money is huge, and access to money and being able to run was big. So you had to rediscover a gender gap. Even though it wasn't as big as people had thought it would be in 1920, it was still there. And then you had to find ways to fund. And for a long time, I thought Emily was somebody who had founded this organization. You guys probably all know it means early money. Early money is like yeast. Right, early money is like yeast. And the essential nature of early money in political campaigns. Right, so I got invited to an Emily's List gathering when I was in Arizona, and the person doing it was Emily, and I thought, well, that's... So it took me years to figure that out. But fortunately, Emily's List worked faster than that, and we began to have this bump in women representatives. It's still really slow, and if you parse out how long it's going to take to get equity, it's like in our daughter's children's lifetime. It's very slow. So we collectively have work to do. We organize women who can accomplish anything if we have the right alliances.
I understand the history that Sarah has so well set forth in terms of what was going on and why men perhaps pushed back and women were pushing forward. But I think it's as simple as power, that men understood what giving the right to vote to women would be. It would immediately confer upon them a level of power and potentially influence that they were guarding very jealously. And so we continue to see that today. We've all heard about how those that have power don't just voluntarily relinquish it. That's because they appreciate what it means.
Well, one way of thinking about the various rights that we have is dividing them into different kinds of categories, right? Sometimes that can be useful. So you have political rights, which include the right to vote, could also include the right to run for office that we've been talking about, the right to serve on a jury. But then there were civil rights. There was the right to control property that you owned. There was the right to contract. And women also had not had full rights in that realm. And that was a different regime than not having the right to vote. That was a regime called coverture, under which if a woman was married, her husband took on her all of those roles for her. So he would control her property. He was the one who had the right to contract. And so, one way of thinking about what the 19th Amendment did and didn't do, perhaps, is because it's so focused, unlike the ERA, unlike the Equal Rights Amendment, on just voting, that it could be read narrowly or broadly, right? And some people thought it was going to be read broadly and it would be the end of all of these other limitations on women's rights. And then in the years after it, you start seeing it being read very narrowly, even to the point where jury service and elective office aren't included in it. And so it really takes until the 1970s for a lot of this to start to change. I mean, it's a series of Supreme Court cases, many of which Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg litigated back when she was a lawyer, that were trying to pull apart these restrictions on women's rights to be breadwinners in their families. A lot of these cases were cases that she brought on behalf of men. Men who were denied survivor's benefits because it was presumed that the wife had not been the breadwinner, right? And so I just think it's an interesting thing to note that looking back at this 100-year history, the first 50 years, we still didn't even start to get into a lot of the issues that are what matter to us most today.
Just a word, those of you from North Carolina might appreciate the fact that it was prior to 1975, say, if you were married, I don't care how long the duration, if you divorced, what you took away from that breakup was only those items of property that had your name on them. And so I don't care how wealthy the family had been, what your socioeconomic status was, you took only that had your name on it. And so it was only after we began electing women to the legislature here in North Carolina that we passed legislation that called for the equitable distribution of marital assets upon the breakup of a marriage. And all of the assets and debts acquired during the course of the marriage were deemed to belong to the marriage, and that they were subject to an equal division. It was presumed that they should be divided equally unless there were some matters that would call for otherwise. And so I'm talking about, I finished law school in 1979, 1981, 82, we were dealing with equitable distribution of marital assets. I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely incredible.
Well, and it gives you an appreciation for why the right to vote mattered.
Yes.
Right? The right to vote led to these other political rights, and then when you get enough women voting and enough women in office, then these other laws start to change. I want to think more about your experiences across your lives and your careers. Do you think it's easier for you now to be a woman in politics or law or other professions than it was when you started out? And how much of that has been the result of these legal and social changes that we're talking about? Kathy, you want to start?
I feel like I'm the baby in terms of being in politics on this stage, but I feel really fortunate that I feel like I came in on a women's wave, right? In 2017, and if you followed what happened in the country then, or in Virginia, we were the center of the country then, we flipped 15 seats in the House of Delegates, which was, unimaginable until it happened. And 11 of those seats were won by women. Vast majority of whom were like me, never thought about running for office. We're kind of busy with our lives in other ways and decided to jump into this space. And you had the first, public defender, social worker, immigrant activist, reporter, people with very different types of professional experiences and also very different types of lived experiences. We elected, the first Asian American women, the first Latinx women, the first out transgender and out lesbian women ever to Virginia state government. And so I'm very fortunate to come in on that with that cohort, because to me it's normal, right? But when you look around the state assembly, you realize we were not the norm. And there's this graphic of like the folks we replaced, and it was my cohort, and then, you know, all these older white men who we had replaced in office, and I found that really fascinating. But to me, it makes me think about what it means for the future. And so I'm a mom of 4, and I remember my children came down in 2018. So my oldest daughter was 7 at the time, about 7. And she, you know, they went home and they play House of Delegates at home, because what else would you play? They vote on things like being able to drink soda and watch TV and things like that. But she was sitting there and she was like, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker. And she looks at me, she was like, Maya, can a woman be a speaker? Right? And I was like, well, yes, we've just never had one in Virginia in 400 years. But this year, we won the majority and we elected the first woman speaker in our and this year when they were playing, after the fall elections, my daughter said, I get to be the speaker now because Miss Eileen is the speaker. And I think you can't quantify what that means for her and for her kids to be able to see more women, whether it's in deanships or, you know, leading departments in academia or in the political realm. And I get really emotionally excited about that, honestly. Yeah.
Just to follow up on what you've said, and perhaps I'm being optimistic, but I think it does make it easier for the next one to come along. You no longer have to imagine or think, can I do this? Because you've seen someone that looks like you do it. And so it definitely makes it easier in my mind. Some of you may remember, I guess it was Banneker that ran the sub 4-minute mile. And prior to the time that he did that, it was never imagined that a human being could run that quickly. It's interesting to note that shortly thereafter, like within a year or 18 months, 4 or 5 other folks had done it. And so there's something to be said for seeing other individuals accomplish things.
Carry away with us. When I was an undergraduate, my professors were all white men, most of whom were a little bit shorter than I am, and I thought, well, this is going to take quite a transformation if this is really what I want to do in my life. So it definitely makes a difference to have role models, to have people that you can see and make it possible to be who you are without having to pretend to be somebody else to get to that spot. And at the same time, there were role models that I would not endorse. There was a queen bee syndrome in a world in which it was structured to make it difficult for women to get ahead. Sometimes women were in that position and liked being the one in that position, and they made it just as difficult for everybody who followed them. And so that was not a model I wanted to adopt. And then it's also those of us who have been tokens, I assume that includes most people probably in this room, know that it's a very difficult position to be in because you're there so that you can be visible, but you do not have enough weight to throw things in a direction that people who put you there want you to do it, rather than the people who allowed you to be there would want you to do it. And so managing those expectations and creating those alliances and finding people who understand and will speak up with you, not on your behalf, but with you, is one of the trickiest things. I definitely think it makes it easier to have pioneers. My way was definitely eased by having people who succeeded before me who were female. There weren't enough of them to make it totally easy. And the fact that the previous woman chair had been 25 years earlier did not exactly create this kind of easy and smooth transition to that. And when I went for my job interviews, and I went to 7 interviews, and I got home the day before I was not allowed to fly anymore. And people were so unused to seeing a pregnant candidate for a professorial job that everywhere I went, people had made arrangements to go to the hospital in case I went into labor. And they also looked at me like, oh my God, she's not only a full professor, but she can reproduce. So, so I think there continue to be these, we're not complete, we're definitely closer, and the number of women in this room show that and what can be done, but I think there's a ways to go.
Yeah. Well, you may recall hearing a few years ago that there were more Fortune 500 CEOs by the name of John than women. I just saw on Twitter the other day that of the advocates who are arguing cases before the United States Supreme Court this year, there are more people named John than women. And if you think about the fact that, when I was in law school 25 years ago, nearly half my class were women, we no longer have the excuse that we are a recent phenomenon. We've now been able to vote for 100 years. We've had equal access to a lot of things for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and yet there are still barriers that are stopping women from getting to the very top. I'm wondering what our panelists think some of those are.
I think there's, clearly some structural barriers, and we can talk about that, right? When you talk about the need to raise the minimum wage, it's mostly women of color, and immigrant women who are in these low-wage positions. I was thinking about this recently because we are debating raising the minimum wage in Virginia, and when we first came to the United States, and my dad's first job, where he got a paycheck, paid the minimum wage in 1982 at it was like $3.35. And the purchasing power of that minimum wage at $3.35 is greater than it is today at $7.25, right? That to me is mind-boggling. But you have that. You have the fact that we don't really have an affordable child care system. And the truth is, in some of our relationships, it might be much more equal than it ever has been in our nation's history, but culturally, but at the same time, women still bear the brunt of child care, right? We don't have family medical leave across the board. We don't, these things that I think are systematically making it hard for women and families to be able to rise up. But I think also there's a cultural expectation. I remember I had just even this new year, I have a very strong supporter, a constituent of mine who said, when I learned you had 4 kids, I wasn't sure how that was going to work. And I was like, well, Dick, I'm now going to have 5. And he was like, oh, right? But I mean, it's like this expectation. And I had somebody else tell me, I think you're great, but I don't know if we're ready for like an immigrant woman to lead our community. And so it's, what are the cultural and societal norms that people are just placing on you as you kind of live your everyday life? And I think that's some of that, depending in all of our different professional and personal spaces, we have to still grapple with.
Speaking specifically about politics, I think one of the barriers is money. And so thank God for Emily's List and other groups that support women financially. Like it or not, in order to get your message out in today's world, you're going to need to have the financial resources to communicate that message, and it's usually through media that costs significant sums of money. And women traditionally have a hard time raising the amount of money that men
And asking
appear
for it.
Yes. And asking for it. Someone said, you have not because you ask not. You just have to learn to ask. But I do believe that is a barrier.
Can you say more about that? So, there is definitely a stereotype about women that they don't ask in negotiations, that they don't ask in politics, that we do not have the same kind of chutzpah to ask. But then there's also a lot of data supporting the idea that we get punished when we do, right? That there are different societal expectations on how we're supposed to behave, and that there's something unseemly about asking for things. So is that a dynamic that you found you've had to navigate?
I have had to navigate that. Like many of the ladies in this room, I'm accustomed to doing what needs to be done. I do it, whether it's at home or with the children or at work. I don't ask anyone to do anything for me that I can do for myself. And so it does take some getting used to ask for help. And we've got to get over that. And as I campaign, I have gotten over that. You have not because you ask not. So,
Have you found that?
I do find that, and I think even, In the state legislature, I painted a very rosy picture. I love the fact that we have such a strong presence of women and such fierce women leaders. But at the same time, I do sometimes sense there's still a good old boys network and how it works. And it's not that those good old boys are all of the same generation, right? Like sometimes I'm like, oh, it's some of my, kind of like, I have some colleagues I feel like are like very much like bros, right? And they know how to navigate this. And I just, like, that's just not the way I communicate. It's not, I'm a juice and soda kind of person. So some of my colleagues have a Methodist whiskey or other types of drinks after a long night in session. And I my first year I brought the baby and I sat there, I was like, can I have some peanuts, right? But like, it's just like a very different culture and that I'm finding. And so there's I forgot the original question, but I do, like how you communicate and how you, and you're expected to kind of engage, I think is really still a very strong culture in doing that. But I think also, stereotypes of Asian American women as kind of more meek and mild and less likely to assert ourselves. And so, always, and some, my own kind of thinking is that just me naturally? Is that how my mother has raised me? Or is that because I'm responding to some of these expectations too? And so sometimes you're wondering how you need to be in a particular place to respond to comments and things like that. And I think lastly, I would say just about running for office, I think the statistic is you have to ask a woman to run like 3 or 5 times before she'll even say, hey, I might actually be qualified to do this, versus a man would be like, well, of course I'm gonna run, right? Like, why wouldn't I? And I think even that, how do you flip that on its head for folks who are interested in running, or some of our girls for the future, and making them think that they, inherently can have that confidence and be out there to go and get it. It's really important.
Yeah. I identify with that so much.
I was thinking the same thing.
It was, for me, in becoming the dean here, it was the 3rd call from a member of the search committee trying to persuade me to apply that finally made me say to my husband, they keep calling, I'm not going to do this. And he was the one who said, you were so ready for this. Like, you need to do this. But I had the sort of imposter syndrome of thinking that it was something that, oh, maybe in 5 years, I just don't know if I'm ready, and that's something we just have to get over. And I want to thank, well, first of all, the audience for being such a terrific, engaged audience and your wonderful questions. And then thank our very amazing panelists.